So Gary Russell Jr.'s nearly 7-year reign as WBC featherweight champion comes to an end after he loses a 12-round majority decision to Mark Magsayo. I didn't do a pre-fight video on this fight because I just thought it'd be another routine defense for Gary Russell. I was completely ignorant as to who Mark Magsayo was, and it turned out it was a very close fight. I'm not going to say it was an entertaining fight. I didn't find it particularly entertaining, but it's still an upset, so let's talk about it. So, as I say, Magsayo won by 12-round majority decision. One judge had it a draw, and the other two judges had it 113 to 115 in favour of Mark Magsayo. And I have to agree with the first judge, I had it a draw too. I had Magsayo winning the first, second, third, 6th, 10th, 11th rounds, and then Gary Russell winning the rest, making it a draw. So how did this fight go? Well, from the first round, there was some pretty scrappy engagement, which is fairly typical when you have an orthodox versus southpaw matchup. Though I was somewhat impressed by Magsayo because he was quite sharp on the counter, especially with the right hand. He was often using a counter right uppercut. That seems to be a punch that he's very confident throwing. And Gary Russell wasn't always coming off the centre line. Oftentimes he was just opting to block instead. But because there was such a massive size difference between Magsayo and Russell he's a tiny man. This guy's, like, when you look at him during the post-fight interviews and he stands next to Jim Gray, he's dwarfed by him. He looks like a little munchkin. So yeah, Gary Russell, very short, very small man. And because of that, because of the size differential, Magsayo, when he'd land a shot, even if it was blocked, there was enough of a weight difference and a force difference to really shake up Gary Russell. And they're not scoring shots because they're blocked, but it's not a good look, and it can really rattle someone who's so much smaller than you. So I edged that round to Magsayo, not by much, but I feel like he did enough. Round 2, there were even more sharp right-hand counters from Magsayo, especially early on. And it just seemed like Gary Russell was struggling to get into a rhythm. And I felt like this was a clear round for Magsayo. Round 3, Magsayo came out and he was displaying some good timing and good feints. And I felt like he was actually outboxing Gary Russell, which is something that you don't necessarily hear because Gary Russell's often seen as being the superior boxer in most of his fights. And Gary Russell, he did start to have some success with some single shots in the final minute, but it was a closer round, but I still felt it was a round for Magsayo nonetheless. And then in the 4th round, I feel like this is the biggest round for discussion, because this is where Gary Russell clearly sustained an injury to his right shoulder, I believe. Initially, it looked like he got hurt by a right hook from Magsayo, but it turns out that he actually evaded the right hook. He managed to lay back just enough so that it didn't hit him. But with some very questionable technique, he tried to counter with like a kind of half hook, half right cross from his southpaw stance. The distance was all wrong, and he mashed up his shoulder, and it looked like it was dislocated because his arm was just hanging, but it must have just been the pain where not allowing him to bring his arm up. It was a better round despite that. In my opinion, it seemed like a better round for Gary Russell because he managed to kind of calm down the end of the round, and I just felt like he edged it. And then from here, Gary Russell started to gain a bit more control, not really landing much clean offense, but I still felt like he won the round. In the round 6, it seemed like Magsayo kind of upped the aggression a little bit more, really piecing up Gary Russell at times with some body shots and uppercuts, and these proved to be very effective weapons for Magsayo, and in my book that earned him another round. Round 7, Gary Russell was throwing virtually nothing with the right hand, obviously because it's injured, but he was able to get off some pot shots with the left hand, and I gave him that round, as I did for the round 8 and round 9. And this part of the fight, Gary Russell was not throwing much, but he was making sure that Magsayo, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, Magsayo, was able to throw even less. So when I was watching it, I just had from what I could see, it looked like Gary Russell was in control. Not like he had a complete stranglehold on the fight, but he was just a bit better at dictating the pace of these rounds. Round 10 and 11 come along, and I gave them to Magsayo purely by virtue of the fact that he was just attempting more, he was landing more, and just pushing the fight a bit more. And then the 12th round was a closer round, but I just feel it was edged by Russell. And so that was my scorecard, my breakdown of the fight. I had it a draw, so 6 rounds apiece to each man. If I was pushed to pick a winner, a definitive winner, I'd have to lean towards Magsayo. And I know that sounds like a bit of an oxymoron because I'm still somewhat on the fence, but the impression I got was that Gary Russell, he effectively managed to kind of control the quiet rounds, but the rounds that I did give him were kind of like the benefit of the doubt, whereas I was a lot more confident in saying that Magsayo won a round. And so for that reason, I just feel like Magsayo, this was his fight for the most part. So I had it a draw, but I do understand why he got the victory. And now, what's next for Gary Russell? Because if I'm correct, if memory serves me correctly, this is his 6th defense of the WBC featherweight title. And he's held it for just under 7 years. And obviously this is a running theme in Gary Russell's career, is the inactivity. But it's really like, what happens next? He's just lost to someone who is like quite unknown. And Magsayo's he's not a chump. He's not a slouch by any means. You know, and there's always like a degree of intrigue when you have these Filipino fighters in lower weights, you know, obviously coming after the Manny Pacquiao era. But I'm not going to say that Magsayo is like a top flight Filipino fight, because some of them, like, they're real dangerous guys, and you can tell that they're going to have a big stake in the division they're in. I don't really get that with Magsayo. I think he's kind of a bit of a run-of-the-mill champion. He's good, don't get me wrong, but is he elite? Nah, I don't think so. Not based on that. I've only seen him once, and it was this fight. I don't think he's anything special right now. I think he's only like 26, so maybe he's still got some years left to develop and become something special. Gary Russell, on the other hand, massively inactive, quite small for the weight. The size difference between these two in this fight was massive. And Gary Russell slowed down. He's not the athlete he used to be. I don't think he's that old. I think he's only like 33. Yeah, he's 33 years old. And they do say that fighters in the lower weight classes do age quicker, so you do have to factor that in. But he's a small guy. He's an older guy now. Certainly is an athlete that he used to be. He's still just as injury prone as he used to be. And I want to talk about this injury because it looked like a dislocation, but when they interviewed Gary Russell at the end, he spoke about how it's most likely a damaged tendon. But he added that this is a long-term injury that dates back to even before he was at the 2008 Olympics. And he's talking about how his team encouraged him to get surgery, but he didn't want to, and this and that. Which, don't scoff, because often things like this happen. You often have fighters and they feel like they get extra credit for just trying to power through injuries. Because Gary Russell, if he even spoke about he was injured leading up to this fight. Like, you don't, in my eyes anyway, and I think some people may agree with me, that you don't get extra credit for going in injured. Well, not really. Like, how do I word this? I don't see it as a badge of honor. If you go in compromised and you lose, you don't really have anyone to blame. And I feel like, obviously it's a touch on psychology. I don't want to go too deep though, but Gary Russell is famously someone who, if you've listened to people's accounts of him in the boxing sphere, he has a bit of like little man syndrome, a bit of like a Napoleon complex. And he probably, like many people with this disposition, They want to go above and beyond. They want to prove themselves to be on the same level as everyone else, achievement-wise, or by some other virtue, because they're not on the same level as everyone else, height-wise or stature-wise, you know. So that doesn't really surprise me, but I feel like it reflects an attitude that many boxers have, where it's just like, oh, I'll just power through it, kind of thing, you know. It's an injury, it's part of the process. Yeah, look, being an athlete is painful. You have to go through a lot of the rigors of training, and it breaks your body down. It really does. But there's nothing wrong with minimizing your injuries and trying to preserve yourself for as long as possible. Because if you look at some of the most successful fighters of all time, they did good jobs of preserving themselves. You know, the likes of Bernard Hopkins. He's someone who was able to fight into his 50s. Not at the highest level necessarily, but, you know, he was able to hold his own against some pretty decent fighters because he preserved himself well. And of course he started late, but that obviously plays a part. But then even if you look at, say, someone like Alexander Usyk and Vasyl Lomachenko, if you look at their training, it's often seen as quite unconventional, but it's kind of varying the training load. How do you train? How do you condition yourself? If you have some variation, it's less likely to break your body down. You're not going to be as jaded physically or psychologically, so it keeps you fresh for longer. And I think this is definitely something that young fighters in the next generation have to look at. They have to look at this, look at how well they can preserve themselves, because you're not going to be in boxing for very long. It's just one of those sports where you don't hang around, regardless of the level you're at. You know, you can be an amateur fighter, and if you're having tough amateur fights and tough sparring and tough training, you're not going to last very long. And so then apply that to the pro game, where you're fighting 12-round fights against legitimate world level fighters who can do you some serious damage. You need to preserve yourself as best as possible. But Gary Russell seems to be another one of those fighters who just wants to kind of grit his teeth and use it as a badge of honor. But hey, that's his prerogative, it's his career. I'm just asking the question of how much longer will Gary Russell Jr.'s career, how much longer will it last? So yeah, that's my assessment of this fight. Not a great one, but check it out if you want to. I can't complain with the scorecards. A draw and then two judges having it in favour of Magsayo for 2 rounds. I don't have a problem with that. Let me know what you thought of this fight, what you think of my assessment. Leave it all in the comment section below. If you can like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.